The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, a town that had seen better days even before the drought hit. Jake Morrison stood at the altar of the small wooden church, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, the leather of his gun belt creaking with each shallow breath. Sweat trickled down his temple, but it wasn't from the heat. Before him, Reverend Whitfield droned on about the sanctity of marriage, his voice competing with the flies buzzing through the stifling air. The congregation sat in rigid rows, women fanning themselves with whatever they could find, men tugging at their Sunday collars. Everyone had come to see Jake Morrison, the most feared gunslinger in 3 counties, finally settle down. Sarah Bennett stood beside him in her mother's wedding dress, pristine white cotton that seemed to glow against the rough-hewn walls. 19 years old, with cornflower blue eyes and hands that had never known a day's hard labor. Her father, Samuel Bennett, sat in the front row, chest puffed with pride. His daughter was marrying the man who'd saved their cattle ranch from rustlers just 6 months prior. Jake's eyes drifted past Sarah to the window, where dust devils danced across the main street. His jaw clenched as he caught sight of the saloon across the way, its bat-wing doors swaying slightly in the breeze. He could almost taste the whiskey, feel the worn cards between his fingers, hear the familiar clink of poker chips. "Do you, Jake Morrison, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" The Reverend's voice cut through his thoughts. Jake turned to look at Sarah. She was beautiful, no doubt about it, pure as mountain snow, gentle as a spring rain, everything a man should want. Her eyes sparkled with hope and dreams of babies and Sunday dinners and a proper home with curtains in the windows. The silence stretched. Sarah's smile faltered slightly. Someone coughed in the back row. Jake's voice came out rough as sandpaper. He cleared his throat, aware of every eye upon him. The weight of his Colt .45 seemed heavier than usual on his hip. Sarah reached out, her small hand touching his arm. "Jake," she whispered, confusion clouding her perfect features. He looked down at her hand, soft, unmarked, innocent. Then he looked at his own scarred, calloused, with dirt under the nails that never seemed to wash clean. Hands that had killed 17 men, though the town only knew about 12. "I can't," he said, louder this time. A collective gasp rippled through the congregation. Sarah's hand fell away as if burned. "What?" Samuel Bennett was on his feet. "What do you mean you can't?" Jake stepped back from the altar, his spurs ringing against the floorboards. "I mean, I can't. This ain't right." "Jake Morrison, you get back here." The Reverend's face had turned purple. "You gave your word you asked for this girl's hand, and I was wrong to do it." Jake's voice was steady now, certain. He looked at Sarah, whose eyes were filling with tears. "You're a good woman. Sarah, you deserve better than what I got to give." "You're humiliating her, Mrs." Bennett shrieked from her pew. "You're destroying her reputation." Jake knew it was true. In a town like Redemption Creek, a woman left at the altar might as well wear a scarlet letter. But marrying her would destroy something in her too, something slower, more painful. He'd seen it happen before. "Jake, please," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Whatever it is, we can work through it. I love you." The word hit him like a bullet. Love. She didn't love him. She loved the idea of him, the heroic gunslinger who'd saved her daddy's ranch, who'd tip his hat to her on Main Street, who'd escort her to church socials. She didn't know about the nightmares, the blood that wouldn't wash off his hands, the ghosts that visited him every time he closed his eyes. "No, you don't," he said quietly, then louder, addressing the whole church. "This wedding's off." He turned and walked down the aisle, past the shocked faces, past the whispers already starting. Martha Henderson clutched her pearls. Tom Bradley half stood as if to stop him, then thought better of it. Even the town drunk, Willard Pike, looked sober with surprise. As Jake pushed through the church doors, he heard Sarah collapse into sobs behind him, Her father's voice boomed. "I'll see you run out of this town. Morrison, you hear me? No man treats a Bennett this way." The sun hit Jake full in the face as he stepped onto the porch. The town that had grudgingly accepted him, that had almost let him belong, would turn on him now. He could already feel it happening, like watching a snake coil before it strikes. He stood there for a moment, looking out at the dusty street, the false-fronted buildings, the American flag hanging limp in the still air. In the distance, a crow cawed from its perch on the gallows at the edge of town. Then Jake Morrison did what he did best. He walked away, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust, heading for the only place in Redemption Creek where he'd ever felt honest, the Broken Spoke Saloon. Behind him, the church bells that should have been ringing in celebration hung silent, and the wedding that should have redeemed Jake Morrison became the scandal that would define him. But as he pushed through those bat-wing doors and into the familiar darkness of the saloon, Jake felt something he hadn't expected. Relief. The bartender, old Pete, looked up in surprise. "Thought you was getting hitched. Jake, pour me a whiskey. Pete, make it a double." As the amber liquid burned down his throat, Jake caught sight of himself in the mirror behind the bar. Same weathered face, same cold eyes, same man he'd always been. Sarah Bennett deserved a farmer, a shopkeeper, someone who could give her the life she'd dreamed of. What Jake didn't know yet was that across the room, in the shadow of the staircase, a woman watched him with knowing eyes, a woman who understood broken things, who'd given up on dreams of white dresses long ago. But that part of the story would come later. For now, Jake Morrison drank his whiskey and listened to the distant sound of a congregation pouring out of the church, their shocked voices carrying on the wind like tumbleweeds across the desert of his conscience. By nightfall, Redemption Creek buzzed like a disturbed hornet's nest. Word traveled faster than wildfire in a town of 800 souls. And Jake Morrison's abandonment of Sarah Bennett at the altar had become the only topic of conversation from the general store to the telegraph office. In the Bennett household, Sarah lay prostrate on her bed, still wearing her wedding dress, now wrinkled and stained with tears. Her mother, Catherine, sat beside her, alternating between comforting pats and indignant exclamations. "That savage, that no-good drifter," Catherine spat. "We welcomed him into our home, and this is how he repays us." Samuel Bennett paced the parlor below, his boots thundering against the floorboards. "I'll have his hide for this," he muttered to anyone who would listen. "Making a fool of my daughter, of our whole family." 3 doors down, Mrs. Augusta Pemberton held court in her sitting room, surrounded by the town's most influential ladies. "I always said there was something off about that man," she declared, adjusting her mourning brooch. "Those gunslinger types can't be civilized. It's like trying to tame a wolf." "Poor Sarah," sighed Mrs. Abigail Crawford, the banker's wife. "She'll never be able to show her face in church again. Who would have her now? Everyone will think there's something wrong with her." "Something wrong with her, Mrs.?" Pemberton's voice dripped with false sympathy. "My dear, when a man like Jake Morrison refuses to bet a woman, even with God's blessing, what else are people to think?" The venom spread through the town's social circles like poison through veins. By the time the sun had fully set, Sarah Bennett had gone from being the most envied young woman in Redemption Creek to an object of pity and speculation. At the Broken Spoke Saloon, Jake nursed his 5th whiskey, aware of the hostile glances and whispered conversations around him. The regular patrons gave him a wide berth, as if his dishonor might be contagious. Even the working girls who usually flocked to successful gunmen kept their distance, sensing the change in the air. "You got some brass showing your face here," growled Luther Hayes, one of Samuel Bennett's ranch hands. He stood with 3 other men near the bar, all of them armed, all of them drunk enough to be dangerous. Jake didn't look up from his glass. "Last I checked, this was a public establishment. Not for men who disgrace decent women." Luther spat. "Sarah Bennett's worth 10 of you. Morrison—" "That's exactly why I didn't marry her." Jake replied quietly. The response seemed to enrage Luther further. His hand moved toward his gun, but old Pete behind the bar cocked his shotgun audibly. "No gunplay in my saloon, boys. Take it outside if you must." Meanwhile, at the modest parsonage beside the church, Reverend Whitfield sat at his desk, penning a sermon that would damn Jake Morrison from the pulpit come Sunday. His wife, Prudence, peered over his shoulder. "You must make an example of him," she urged. "Such behavior cannot go unpunished. The moral fabric of our community is at stake." "Indeed," the Reverend agreed, his pen scratching furiously. "A man who breaks sacred vows before God deserves nothing less than excommunication from decent society." As the night deepened, a figure emerged from the shadows near the church. Margaret Maggie Brennan pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as she made her way through the back alleys of Redemption Creek. At 32, she'd lived enough lives for 3 women. Widow, fallen woman, survivor, the titles clung to her like dust on a traveling coat. She'd heard about the morning spectacle. Of course, everyone had, but unlike the others, Maggie felt no surprise. She'd recognized something in Jake Morrison the first time she'd seen him, a kindred spirit carrying wounds that wouldn't heal, making choices that looked cruel to those who'd never walked through hell. The respectable ladies crossed the street when they saw her coming. The men either leered or looked away, depending on whether their wives were watching. Maggie had learned to live in the margins, in the space between what the town preached and what it practiced after dark. Back at the saloon, the tension had thickened like smoke. More of Bennett's men had arrived, and Jake could feel the violence brewing like a summer storm. "You know what you are, Morrison." Luther's voice was slurred but steady. "You're a coward. Only a coward would hurt an innocent girl like that." Jake finally looked up, his gray eyes cold as winter steel. "And only a fool would push an innocent girl into a life she ain't prepared for. You want to make me the villain, Luther, fine, but that girl will thank me someday, even if she don't know it now. She won't get the chance." Another ranch hand chimed in. "Her daddy's already talking about sending her back east. Says she can't stay here with the shame of it." This was news to Jake, and something twisted in his chest. He'd wanted to spare Sarah pain, not drive her from her home. "That's right." Luther pressed on, sensing he'd found a weak spot. "The Bennett family's leaving Redemption Creek because of you, selling the ranch, taking their business elsewhere, all because you couldn't keep your word like a man." The other patrons had begun to clear out, sensing the inevitable. Old Pete had stopped pretending to clean glasses, his hand resting on the shotgun beneath the bar. Outside, Maggie Brennan paused beneath the saloon's grimy window. Through the glass, she could see Jake Morrison surrounded by angry men, isolated even among the outcasts. She recognized the look in his eyes, the weariness of someone who'd stopped trying to explain himself to a world that had already made up its mind. In the morning, Reverend Whitfield would denounce Jake from the pulpit. The Ladies' Temperance Society would use him as an example of the evils of drink and loose morals. Samuel Bennett would put pressure on the town council to revoke Jake's welcome. Sarah would become a cautionary tale whispered to young girls about the dangers of trusting dangerous men. But tonight, in the flickering lamplight of the broken spoke, Jake Morrison sat alone with his whiskey and his choices, while the town that had almost accepted him prepared to cast him out entirely. He'd saved their cattle, defended their interests, and walked their streets with something approaching belonging. Now he was just another drifter who'd proved what everyone suspected, that some men were too broken to be fixed, too wild to be tamed, too honest to play the roles that civilization demanded. The tragedy wasn't that Jake had left Sarah at the altar. The tragedy was that in trying to save her from himself, he'd condemned them both to different kinds of exile. Sarah would leave Redemption Creek with her reputation in tatters, and Jake would remain, more isolated than ever. As Luther Hayes and his men finally decided to postpone their vengeance for another day, filing out with muttered threats and promises, Jake ordered another whiskey. Tomorrow would bring new consequences, new accusations, new reminders of what he'd done. But tonight, he'd drink to the only truth he knew, that sometimes the cruelest thing looked like kindness, and the kindest thing looked like cruelty. Sarah Bennett would learn to hate him, and that hatred would set her free in ways his love never could have. Outside, Maggie Brennan turned away from the window and disappeared back into the shadows, carrying with her the image of a man who'd chosen honesty over honor, and paid the price that such choices always demanded in a place like Redemption Creek. 3 nights had passed since the wedding that wasn't, and Jake Morrison had made the Broken Spoke his second home. The whiskey helped dull the sharp edges of the town's contempt, though nothing could completely silence the voices that followed him like tumbleweeds down Main Street. He sat in his usual corner, back to the wall, facing the door, old habits from his gunslinging days. The bottle before him was half empty, or half full, depending on how much hope a man had left. Jake had stopped measuring hope a long time ago. The saloon was thick with smoke and the sour smell of spilled beer. Piano music tinkled from the corner where Professor Daniels, a man who'd never seen the inside of any university, played for drinks and whatever coins the patrons threw his way. The working girls had given up trying to catch Jake's attention, sensing the futility in his 1,000-yard stare. That's when she approached. Maggie Brennan moved through the saloon like smoke through moonlight, present but somehow untouchable. She wore a faded green dress that had seen better decades, but she carried herself with a dignity that transcended worn fabric and scuffed boots. Her auburn hair, streaked with premature gray, was pulled back in a simple knot that emphasized the sharp angles of her face. Without asking permission, she pulled out the chair across from Jake and sat down. Up close, he could see the fine lines around her hazel eyes, the kind that came from squinting against too many harsh suns and harder truths. "Buy a lady a drink?" she asked, though her tone suggested it wasn't really a question. Jake looked up, his gray eyes focusing for the first time in hours. He recognized her. Everyone in Redemption Creek knew Maggie Brennan's story, or at least the version that got whispered in polite company. Widowed at 23 when her husband died in a mining accident, turned to the oldest profession to survive. Now she existed in that peculiar purgatory reserved for women who'd fallen from grace but hadn't quite hit bottom. Lady Jake's mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "That's generous." Maggie laughed, a sound like whiskey over gravel. "No more generous than calling you a gentleman, Mr. Morrison." He pushed the bottle across the table. She produced a glass from somewhere women like Maggie always knew where to find what they needed, and poured herself a healthy measure. "Surprised you'd risk being seen with me," Jake said. "I'm not exactly popular company these days." "Neither am I." She took a sip, didn't flinch at the burn. "Seems we're both experts at disappointing the good people of Redemption Creek." Around them, the saloon's regular inhabitants pointedly ignored their table, even in a place that catered to the town's sins. There were hierarchies. A gunslinger who'd humiliated a respectable woman and a fallen woman who'd never quite learned to stay fallen quietly. They made for a pairing that offended even flexible morals. "I heard the Bennetts are packing up," Maggie said conversationally. "Taking the morning stage to Denver, then the train back east." Jake's jaw tightened. "Good. Sarah will have a chance at a real life there." "And you think that absolves you?" He looked at her sharply. "I'm not looking for absolution." "No," Maggie agreed. "You're looking for punishment. That's why you're still here, letting them sharpen their tongues on your reputation. You could have ridden out 3 days ago, found another town that doesn't know your sins." "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" She leaned forward, and Jake caught a whiff of her perfume rose water trying to cover something earthier. "I know exactly what it's like to make a choice that saves someone else but damns yourself. The only difference is, I didn't have the luxury of choosing my fall from grace." Jake studied her face, seeing past the powder and paint to something raw underneath. "What do you want, Maggie?" "Same thing you do. I expect a few hours where I don't have to pretend to be sorry for surviving." Their eyes met and held. In that moment, Something passed between them: recognition, understanding, maybe even a kind of weary kinship. Two people who'd learned that sometimes the only honest thing was to stop pretending you could be better than you were. "Old Pete," Jake called without looking away from Maggie. "Bring another glass." Pete complied, though his expression made it clear he didn't approve. Maggie Brennan in the broken spoke was one thing: she was part of the scenery, like the faro tables and spittoons. But Jake Morrison publicly sharing a bottle with her, that was something else entirely. "You know this'll make things worse for you," Maggie said as Jake poured. "The town's already got you tried and convicted for breaking that girl's heart. Now you're drinking with the local Scarlet woman. They'll say you left Sarah for me." "Let them talk," Jake said. "They'll say what they want regardless." Maggie raised her glass. "To the truth, then, however much it costs." They drank, and the whiskey burned less than the knowing in her eyes. Luther Hayes chose that moment to push through the Batwing doors, flanked by two other Bennett Ranch hands. His bloodshot eyes swept the room and landed on Jake's table. The sneer that twisted his features when he saw Maggie sitting there could have curdled milk. "Well, well," Luther announced loudly. "Guess we know now why you couldn't marry a decent woman. Morrison had your sights set lower all along." The saloon fell silent. Professor Daniel's fingers froze over the piano keys. Even the poker players looked up from their cards. Jake's hand didn't move toward his gun, but something in his stillness made Luther's companions take a step back. "You got something to say? Luther, say it and move on." "Oh, I'll say it," Luther snarled. "Jake Morrison, the big bad gunslinger. Too good for Sarah Bennett, but just right for Maggie Brennan's bed. Makes sense now. Trash seeks its own level." Maggie's face didn't change, but Jake saw her fingers tighten on her glass. She'd heard worse, he knew. Women in her position always did, but that didn't make it easier. "Careful, Luther," Jake said quietly. "Your quarrel's with me, not her." "My quarrel's with anyone who—" Maggie stood abruptly, cutting him off. "Your quarrel's with yourself, Mr. Hayes. For all your righteous anger, I noticed you knew exactly where to find me last Tuesday night when your wife was at her sister's. Funny how your morals only work in daylight." Luther's face went purple. His hand dropped toward his gun, but Jake was already standing, his own hand hovering over his Colt. "Draw that iron and you'd better use it," Jake said, his voice deadly calm. "Otherwise, get out." The moment stretched taut as a hangman's rope. Then Luther spat on the floor and turned on his heel. "This ain't over, Morrison. You and your whore both." After they left, the saloon slowly returned to its normal hum of sin and forgiveness. Jake and Maggie sat back down, the violence averted but its promise lingering like gun smoke. "I should go," Maggie said. "Stay." The word surprised them both. Jake cleared his throat. "Finish your drink at least. Don't give them the satisfaction of running you off." She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her face. "You know what your problem is, Jake Morrison. You're trying to be noble in a world that's run out of room for nobility. And you, me, I stopped trying to be anything but what I am a long time ago." She raised her glass again. "Here's to the fallen. At least we know which direction we're headed." They drank again. Two damaged souls finding a moment's peace in shared damnation. Outside, Redemption Creek nursed its scandals and sharpened its judgments. But inside the broken spoke, Jake Morrison and Maggie Brennan sat together, guilty of nothing more than recognizing their own brokenness in each other's eyes. The night was still young, and their sins were already legend. Tomorrow would bring fresh consequences. But tonight, they had whiskey and truth and the strange comfort of being beyond redemption together. The walk from the broken spoke to Jake's cabin took them through the darker parts of Redemption Creek, where the respectable folk didn't venture after sunset. Maggie walked beside him, neither touching nor maintaining artificial distance, comfortable with the ambiguity of their situation. Jake's place sat on the outskirts of town, a rough-hewn cabin he'd bought from a prospector who'd given up on finding gold and headed further west. It wasn't much 2 rooms, a wood stove, furniture that had seen better decades, but it was private, and privacy was worth more than comfort to a man like Jake Morrison. He pushed open the door, lit the oil lamp on the table. The yellow light threw shadows across the sparse interior, a narrow bed with an iron frame, a washstand with a cracked mirror, his rifle propped in the corner. Everything a man needed. Nothing he didn't. Maggie entered without hesitation, though they both knew she was crossing more than just a threshold. She moved to the window, pushing aside the piece of burlap that served as a curtain, looking out at the scattered lights of town. "You can see the church steeple from here," she observed. "Must have been quite a view this morning." Jake poured water from the pitcher into 2 tin cups, wishing he had something stronger to offer. "Didn't watch." "Liar." She turned from the window, accepting the cup he offered. "You watched. Men like you always watch the consequences of their choices." He sat on the room's only chair, leaving her the bed. She perched on its edge, neither prim nor provocative, just tired. In the lamplight, he could see the careful repairs in her dress, the places where she'd mended tears and reinforced seams. Everything about Maggie Brennan spoke of making do, of surviving past the point where survival stopped being noble and became just another kind of stubbornness. "Tell me about him," Jake said suddenly. "Your husband." Maggie's fingers tightened on the tin cup. "Why?" "Because I want to know what kind of man was lucky enough to have you when you still believed in luck." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, Thomas. His name was Thomas. He was nothing special to look at short, going bald even at 25, hands already gnarled from working the mines. But he made me laugh, even when we didn't have money for food. He could make me laugh. Her voice grew distant. The cave-in took him and 12 others. They brought up the bodies 3 days later. I identified him by his wedding ring. His face was... She stopped, took a sip of water. After that, laughter didn't come so easy. "How long before..." Jake stopped, not sure how to phrase it delicately. "Before I started selling myself." Maggie's smile was sharp as broken glass. 6 months. I tried honest work first. Washing, sewing, cooking. But honest work doesn't pay enough to live on. Not for a woman alone. The first time was the hardest. After that, it was just anatomy. Jake understood. He'd crossed his own lines, done things that had seemed impossible until hunger or necessity made them inevitable. "I killed my first man when I was 17, he offered in trade. "Cattle thief, drew on me first. Self-defense," everyone said, but I'll never forget the look in his eyes when the bullet hit, like he was surprised. Like he'd forgotten actions had consequences. "How many since?" Maggie asked, no judgment in her voice. 17, maybe 18. There was one in Tucson I'm not sure about. He might have lived." Jake stared at his hands. "Sarah's father called me a hero for running off those rustlers. But I'm just a killer who happened to kill the right people that time." "Is that why you couldn't marry her? Because you think you're too stained?" Jake stood abruptly, paced to the window. "I couldn't marry her because I've seen what happens when men like me try to play house. My father was a gunfighter before he met my mother. Thought he could change. Thought love was enough. It wasn't. The violence followed him home, got inside him like a sickness. By the time I was 10, my mother would flinch every time he moved too fast. By the time I was 12, she stopped flinching, stopped feeling anything at all. She died when I was 14, and I swear it was from relief." "So you broke that girl's heart to save her from becoming your mother," Maggie said. "How noble. How perfectly self-sacrificing. Did you ever think maybe she should have gotten a say in her own fate?" Jake turned on her, angry. "What would you know about it?" "Everything," Maggie shot back. "You think you're the only one who's made choices for other people's own good. I had a sister once, prettier than me, younger, still innocent when Thomas died. She wanted to help, Wanted to get work in the saloons with me. I told her no, told her to get out of town, told her I never wanted to see her again. Broke her heart to save her virtue." She laughed bitterly. "Last I heard, she married a banker in San Francisco. Has 3 children and a house with real glass windows. Hates me for abandoning her, but she's respectable. Sometimes that's the only gift we can give, letting them hate us so they can stay clean." The anger drained from Jake as quickly as it had come. He returned to his chair, suddenly exhausted. "You always this insightful about other people's pain." "Only recognize what I've seen before," Maggie said. "We're not so different. You and me, both of us so busy protecting others from ourselves that we forgot we might be worth saving too." "I'm not worth saving." "Neither am I. That's what makes us perfect for each other." She set down her cup, moved to kneel beside his chair, not seductively, just wearily, like someone seeking simple human contact. "I didn't come here expecting promises. Jake, I know better than that, but maybe, just for tonight, we could stop punishing ourselves, stop being object lessons and cautionary tales, just be 2 people who understand the weight of the choices we've made." Jake looked down at her, saw his own exhaustion reflected in her eyes. Slowly, carefully, like he was approaching a spooked horse, he reached out and touched her face. She leaned into his palm, and he felt the wetness of tears she probably didn't know she was crying. "I'm no good for you either," he warned. "I know," she whispered. "That's why it's safe. We can't disappoint each other because we don't expect anything but truth." He helped her to her feet, led her to the narrow bed. They lay down fully clothed, neither rushing toward what everyone would assume happened anyway. Instead, they held each other in the darkness. 2 people who'd forgotten what it felt like to be touched without transaction, without performance, without the weight of reputation and expectation. "Tell me something true," Maggie whispered against his chest. "I'm scared all the time," Jake admitted to the darkness. "Scared of what I am, what I've done, what I might do. The only time I'm not scared is when I'm holding a gun, and that scares me most of all." "I talk to Thomas sometimes," Maggie confessed in return. "Late at night, when the town's asleep, I tell him about my day, about the men who look through me like I'm furniture, about how I can't remember what his laugh sounded like anymore. I think maybe I'm going crazy." "If you are, we'll be crazy together." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in shared damage and the strange comfort of being known. Outside, Redemption Creek slept its righteous sleep, dreaming of Sunday services and proper marriages and the clear lines between good and evil. But in Jake Morrison's cabin, 2 souls found a different kind of salvation, not redemption, not forgiveness, just the simple grace of being seen clearly and held anyway. Tomorrow would bring judgment and consequences and fresh reasons for shame. But tonight, they had this truth and touch and the terrible freedom of having nothing left to lose. The lamp burned low, casting dancing shadows on the rough walls. And somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the indifferent stars. Dawn came to Redemption Creek like an unwelcome debt collector, bringing with it the harsh light of consequence. By the time the sun had fully risen, everyone who mattered knew that Maggie Brennan hadn't returned to her rented room above the millinery shop. Mrs. Dalton, who ran the boarding house next door, had been watching she always watched and spread the news with the efficiency of a telegraph wire. Jake woke to find Maggie already dressed, standing at his small stove making coffee with the few supplies he had. She moved with practiced quiet, the kind learned by women who'd grown used to leaving before Dawn's judgment arrived. But this morning, she stayed. "Coffee's weak," she apologized, handing him a cup. "But it's hot." They drank in silence, both knowing that stepping outside would be like walking into a storm they'd been watching gather all night. Through the thin walls, they could hear the town waking up, roosters crowing, wagons creaking, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, normal sounds of a normal day. Except nothing would be normal for them again. "The Bennetts left on the morning stage," Maggie said, having heard the departure from the window. Sarah was wearing a veil. Wouldn't look at anyone. Jake felt the familiar twist of guilt. It's better this way. For her or for you? Before he could answer, they heard horses approaching, several of them, moving with the deliberate pace of men on a mission. Jake reached for his gun belt, strapped it on with movements made automatic by years of survival. Stay inside, he told Maggie. Like hell. She pulled a Derringer from her boot, a tiny nickel-plated thing that wouldn't stop much but showed she wasn't defenseless. Your fights are mine now. That's what sharing a bed means, even if all we shared was sleep. Jake wanted to argue, but the riders were already in his yard. Through the window, he counted 6 men: Reverend Whitfield, Marshall Thompson, 2 members of the town council, Luther Hayes, and Samuel Bennett's foreman, Bill Crenshaw, a delegation of righteousness, come to deliver judgment. Jake opened the door before they could knock, standing in the doorway like a barrier between them and Maggie. Gentlemen, bit early for social calls. Reverend Whitfield sat rigid in his saddle, his face purple with indignation. You've gone too far this time, Morrison. First you humiliate an innocent girl, now you flaunt your degeneracy with this. Careful, Reverend. Jake's voice carried warning. Judge not. Wasn't that somewhere in your book? Marshall Thompson, a pragmatic man who'd always treated Jake fairly, looked uncomfortable. Jake, the town council met last night. There's talk of revoking your residence. Folks don't feel safe with you around anymore. I've never raised a hand to anyone who didn't draw on me first. Jake said, That hasn't changed. You've corrupted the moral fabric of our community. Councilman Fletcher interjected, his thin face pinched with distaste. What kind of example does this set for our children? Maggie appeared beside Jake, chin raised despite the disgust on the men's faces. The same example you set, Mr. Fletcher, when you visit the Broken Spoke every Thursday while your wife thinks you're at the Masonic Lodge. Or you, Mr. Whitfield, when you skim from the collection plate to pay your gambling debts. At least Jake and I are honest about our sins. The accusations landed like bullets. Fletcher's face went white. Whitfield's purple deepened to near black. But it was Luther Hayes who exploded. Shut your filthy mouth! Whore! He spurred his horse forward. You've got no right to speak to decent folk. Jake stepped fully outside, hand hovering over his colt. That's twice you've insulted a lady in my presence, Luther. There won't be a third time. Lady Luther laughed, ugly and harsh. She's nothing but a... The gunshot cut him off. Jake's colt had barely cleared leather, the motion so fast most of the men didn't see it. The bullet took Luther's hat off, sent it spinning into the dust. Luther's horse reared, nearly unseating him. Next one goes lower. Jake said calmly, Any man who wants to discuss my choices can do it with iron. Otherwise, get off my property. Marshall Thompson raised a calming hand. No need for gunplay. Jake, we're just trying to maintain order. Order. Maggie laughed bitterly. Is that what you call it when half the married men in town have credit at the Broken Spoke, when the same people who condemn me in daylight come knocking after dark? Your order is nothing but hypocrisy wearing its Sunday best. Nevertheless, Reverend Whitfield had found his voice again, though he kept glancing at Jake's still-drawn gun. This arrangement cannot continue. It's an affront to God and man. Then let God judge it. Jake said, Last I checked, you were just a man. Reverend. A man who's been sampling the communion wine a bit too freely, from what I hear. The Reverend's face went from purple to white and back again. How dare you! I dare because I'm already damned in your eyes. Jake cut him off. What more can you do to me, exile me, hate me? You're already doing that. At least I've got the guts to live my choices in daylight instead of sneaking around in the dark. The town won't stand for this. Councilman Harris, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. Morrison, you've contributed to our community. We acknowledge that, but this situation, it's untenable. People are talking about taking matters into their own hands. Let them come. Jake said, I've faced down Apaches, bandits, and killers a lot tougher than your town mob. Any man who wants to enforce his morality at gunpoint better be ready to die for his convictions. Is that a threat? Marshal Thompson's hand moved toward his own gun. It's a promise, Jake replied. I've done nothing illegal. Maggie's done nothing illegal. Your problem is with our choices, not our crimes. And I'll be damned if I'll be run out of town by a bunch of hypocrites who can't stand seeing their own sins reflected in someone else's honesty. Luther, who'd recovered his composure, if not his hat, spat in the dust. You think you're so high and mighty, Morrison, but you're nothing but a killer who couldn't even keep his word to a decent woman. Now you're laying with whores and acting like it makes you righteous. Maggie stepped forward before Jake could respond. You want to know the difference between Jake and the rest of you. He broke Sarah Bennett's heart to save her from a life she couldn't understand. You all would have let him marry her, knowing what he was, just so you could maintain your pretty picture of respectability, which is really the greater cruelty. Don't you dare defend him, Whitfield snapped. He's dragged you into his sin. I walked here on my own 2 feet, Maggie interrupted. With my eyes open and my choice made, that's more than most women in this town can say about their marriages. The standoff stretched taut, 6 men on horses, supposedly representing law and morality, facing down a gunfighter and a fallen woman who refused to act ashamed. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the dusty yard. Finally, Marshal Thompson sighed. Jake, I can't arrest you for anything, but I can't protect you either if the town decides to take action. You understand that? I've never asked for protection, Jake said, just to be left alone. That's not how towns work, the marshal replied sadly. Especially not when you're rubbing their noses in what they'd rather not see. Then maybe it's the town that needs changing, not us, Maggie suggested. That earned her a chorus of derisive snorts and muttered curses. But Jake noticed something in Marshal Thompson's eyes, not agreement. Exactly, but a flicker of uncomfortable recognition. We'll be watching, Whitfield declared, turning his horse. Both of you. 1 step out of line. 1 violation of law or decency. You'll be watching anyway. Jake observed. That's what people like you do. Watch and whisper and judge. At least we give you something interesting to talk about. The delegation rode off. But Jake and Maggie knew this was far from over. They'd drawn battle lines in the dust of a moral war that had no clean victories, only casualties of different kinds. They'll be back, Maggie said quietly. With more men, maybe torches, definitely righteousness. I know. Jake holstered his gun. You should go. This isn't your fight. She laughed, a sound with little humor. Where would I go? This town is all I know. Besides, she looked up at him. I'm tired of running from other people's judgments. Maybe it's time to stand and fight. It'll get worse before it gets better, if it gets better at all. I know that too. She took his hand. Her fingers work-roughened but steady. But at least we'll face it with our eyes open. That's more than most people can say. As the dust settled from the departing horses, Jake and Maggie stood together in the harsh morning light. They'd chosen each other. Chosen truth over comfort. Chosen to live their sins honestly rather than hide them in shadow. The price would be high exile. Violence. Maybe worse. But for the first time in years, neither of them felt alone. And in a world full of hypocrites and hidden sins, that was its own kind of salvation. The week that followed brought a Cold War to Redemption Creek. Jake and Maggie moved through town like ghosts that everyone could see but no one would acknowledge. Shopkeepers served them with averted eyes and exact change, making it clear that commerce was the only relationship they'd tolerate. Children were yanked inside when they passed. Good Christian women clutched their shawls tighter and crossed to the other side of the street. But it was in the quiet moments that the truth began to surface, like gold dust settling in a prospector's pan. Jake sat on the porch of his cabin, cleaning his rifle when Maggie returned from town with supplies. Her face was set in the careful mask she wore in public, but he could see the strain around her eyes. "Mrs. Henderson threw me out of the general store," she reported, setting down a half-empty basket. "Said she wouldn't sell goods to support a house of sin. We'll go to Carson City for supplies if we have to," Jake said. Maggie shook her head. "Running won't solve this. Besides, I've spent too many years letting them chase me into corners." She sat beside him on the step, her shoulder touching his. "Do you ever wonder why you left Sarah at that altar, the real reason? Not the noble one you tell yourself." Jake's hand stilled on the rifle. "What do you mean?" "I mean, was it really about protecting her? Or were you protecting yourself from having to pretend to be someone you're not?" The question hung between them like smoke. Jake set the rifle aside, stared out at the distant mountains. "My mother used to sing while she cooked," he said quietly. "Church hymns, mostly. Amazing Grace was her favorite. After my father started drinking heavy, she sang louder, like volume could drown out the sound of breaking things. The day she died, the house was so quiet, I could hear the clock ticking from 3 rooms away." Maggie waited, knowing there was more. Sarah hummed while she embroidered. Little tunes, happy sounds. The first time I heard it, all I could think was how long before I made her stop. How long before she'd learn to move quiet, speak soft, exist small. I couldn't, his voice caught. I couldn't be the reason another woman learned to live in fear. "But Sarah wasn't your mother," Maggie pointed out gently. "And you're not your father." "Aren't I?" Jake laughed bitterly. "I've killed more men than he ever did. Just because I do it legal doesn't make the blood wash off any easier." "You've never raised a hand to me," Maggie said. "Even when I've pushed, even when I've said things meant to hurt, you're not him, Jake. You're just afraid you could be." They sat in silence, watching the sun paint the desert red. Then Maggie spoke again, her voice distant. "Want to know the real reason I never left Redemption Creek, why I stayed even when every decent person made it clear I was unwelcome?" Jake nodded. "Thomas is buried here, in the paupers section of the cemetery, but still here, every Sunday, while the good folks are in church praying for their souls. I visit his grave. I tell him about my week, about the men who see me as less than human, about the women who used to be my friends. I tell him I'm sorry for what I became, but not sorry for surviving." She paused. "Last Sunday, I told him about you, about the man who gave up respectability rather than live a lie. He would have liked you. I think he valued honesty above all else." "What happened to him, really?" Maggie's jaw tightened. "Cave-in, like I said, but it was an accident. The mine owner, Garrison, knew that shaft was unstable. The foreman had reported it 3 times, but closing it would have meant lost profits. So Garrison ordered them to keep working. 13 men died so he could make his fortune a few dollars richer. And Garrison went to San Francisco, lives in a mansion now. I hear donates to churches, gets his name on buildings, respectable as they come." Her laugh was sharp. "And I'm the one they call immoral." Jake understood then. It wasn't just about survival for Maggie. It was about bearing witness, about refusing to let the town forget its own sins, even as it condemned hers. "There's something else," Maggie said, reaching into her pocket. She pulled out a small daguerreotype, edges worn from handling. "My sister sent this last month, her eldest daughter." Jake looked at the image of a young girl, perhaps 10 years old, with Maggie's eyes and stubborn chin. "She's beautiful. Her name is Margaret, after me." Maggie's voice broke slightly. "My sister wrote that she tells her daughter about her brave Aunt Maggie who lives in the Wild West, makes up stories about my adventures. If she only knew." "Maybe she does," Jake suggested. "Maybe she knows exactly who you are and loves you anyway." Maggie tucked the picture away. "Pretty thought, but we both know the world doesn't work that way." A rider approached from town Doc Holcomb. his medical bag tied to his saddle. He reined up at a respectful distance, tipped his hat. "Jake, Miss Brennan," he acknowledged, unlike most of the town. His tone held no judgment. "Thought you should know. There's talk. Luther Hayes has been stirring up the miners, telling them you're a threat to their womenfolk. Marshal Thompson's trying to keep a lid on things, but eventually someone's going to do something stupid." Jake finished. Doc Holcomb nodded. "I've seen this before. Town gets righteous, decides someone needs casting out, usually ends with blood." He looked at Maggie. "You especially should be careful. There's talk of running you out on a rail." "Let them try," Maggie said quietly. "I've survived worse than tar and feathers." The doctor sighed. "Pride goes before a fall. Miss Brennan, sometimes the smart thing is knowing when to bend. And sometimes," Jake interjected, "the only thing worth keeping is the pride. Thanks for the warning, Doc." After the doctor left, they prepared dinner in companionable silence. It had become their routine, Maggie cooking, while Jake tended to the horses and secured the property. Domestic without being false. Comfortable without pretending to be something they weren't. "I've been thinking," Maggie said as they ate, "about your father. You said the violence got inside him like a sickness. What if it wasn't the violence that was the sickness? What if it was the pretending, trying to be something he wasn't, until the effort of it ate him alive?" Jake considered this. "Maybe. We're not pretending," she continued. "Not trying to be respectable or proper or anything but what we are. Two damaged people who found each other. Maybe that's why this feels—" She searched for the word. "Right," Jake suggested. "Honest," she corrected. "It feels honest. And that's worth more than all the respectability in Redemption Creek." That night, as they lay in the narrow bed, Maggie told him the rest of her story, about the first months after Thomas died, when she'd tried to survive on pride and principles, about the hunger that finally drove her to the broken spoke, about the moment she realized that shame was a luxury she couldn't afford. Jake held her and shared his own darkness, the faces of the men he'd killed, the dreams where they asked him why, the fear that violence wasn't just his profession but his nature. "We're quite a pair," Maggie murmured against his chest. "The killer and the fallen woman. Sounds like a dime novel." "Except in the novels, we'd be redeemed by the last chapter. Find God or gold or true love that washes all the sins away." "This is better," she said. "This is real." Outside, a storm was building over the mountains. Lightning flickered in the distance, and the wind carried the smell of rain. Change was coming to Redemption Creek, whether the town wanted it or not. Jake and Maggie held each other in the darkness, two souls who'd stopped running from their truth. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new condemnations, possibly violence. But tonight they had this acceptance without absolution, love without lies, and the fierce freedom of having nothing left to lose but each other. The storm broke just before dawn, washing the desert clean, but some stains, they both knew, were meant to last, and maybe that was its own kind of blessing. The mob came at sunset, when the desert light turned everything the color of dried blood. Jake had been expecting them for days, had seen the signs in the way men gathered in small groups on street corners, in the increasing boldness of the insults thrown their way, in Marshal Thompson's worried warnings that his authority was wearing thin. They came 30-strong miners mostly, their faces already flushed with whiskey courage, but also shopkeepers, ranch hands, and men who simply enjoyed the sanctioned violence of a righteous mob. Luther Hayes rode at their head, finally getting the confrontation he'd been orchestrating since the wedding. Jake stood on his porch, rifle across his knees, Colt loose in its holster. Maggie sat beside him, that little derringer in her lap, her face calm as a church painting. They discussed running, but where would they go? Every town had its own version of Redemption Creek's hypocrisy. "Morrison," Luther's voice carried across the yard. "Time's up. You and your whore are leaving. Tonight, one way or another." "Funny thing about time," Jake replied, not raising his voice but letting it carry. "It's only up when a man stops breathing. I'm still breathing fine. Luther." Some of the mob shifted uneasily. Jake Morrison's reputation with a gun wasn't built on boasts, but on bodies. But Luther had liquor and numbers on his side. "There's 30 of us. Morrison, you might get some, but you won't get all. And then what happens to your woman?" Maggie stood slowly, stepped to the porch rail. "My name is Margaret Brennan. I was married in the church you all attend. I nursed 3 of your children through scarlet fever. Mrs. Clayton, I sewed your daughter's wedding dress. Mrs. Harper, I am not his woman or the whore. I am a person you all knew before grief and hunger changed my circumstances." "You changed more than circumstances." Someone shouted from the crowd. "You changed into something unnatural." "I changed into someone who survived," Maggie shot back, "which is more than some of you would have done in my place." Jake admired her courage, but he could see it wasn't working. The mob hadn't come for conversation. They'd come for blood, dressed up as moral judgment. "Here's what's going to happen," Luther announced. "You're going to get on your horse. Morrison, ride out and don't look back. The woman, she's got other debts to pay." Like hell. Jake stood, rifle coming up smooth and easy. "Anyone touches her goes through me." "So be it." Luther raised his hand, and Jake saw the plan now. They wouldn't rush him too dangerous. They'd pick their shooters, probably promise them extra shares of whatever property Jake left behind. The first shot came from the left, shattering the window. Jake spun, fired, saw a man tumble from behind a wagon. More shots followed, splinters exploding from the porch posts. Jake pushed Maggie down, returned fire with deadly accuracy. Another man screamed, clutching his shoulder. But there were too many, and they had cover. Jake's ammunition wouldn't last forever. "The cabin!" Maggie shouted over the gunfire. They retreated inside, Jake covering their movement. Bullets thudded into the log walls like deadly rain. Inside, Jake rushed to bar the door while Maggie grabbed his spare ammunition. "How many did you hit?" 3, maybe 4, not enough." He peered through a gap in the shutters. The mob was advancing, using overturned wagons and water troughs as cover. "They'll try to burn us out." "Then we make them pay for every inch," Maggie said, checking her Derringer. 2 shots, not much, but she'd make them count. The siege intensified. Glass shattered, crockery exploded, the air filled with dust and gun smoke. Jake moved from window to window, picking his shots, making every bullet matter. But he could smell smoke now they'd set fire to the lean-to attached to the cabin. "Jake!" Maggie pointed to the back wall where flames were already licking through the gaps between logs. This was how it would end. Then, burned out like rats or shot down trying to escape. Jake felt a strange peace at the thought. At least he'd die honestly, defending something that mattered instead of killing for pay. Then, through the chaos, came a new sound: hoofbeats, lots of them, and a voice roaring with authority. "Stand down, everyone, stand down, or I'll shoot you myself." Marshal Thompson had arrived with his own force, Doc Holcomb, the banker Crawford. Several prominent citizens who'd decided mob rule was bad for business, and most surprisingly, Reverend Whitfield. "This is murder," Thompson shouted. "You're attempting to murder 2 people. Where's your Christian charity? Where's your law and order?" "They're a blight," Luther argued. But some of his supporters were already backing away, suddenly remembering they had families and reputations to protect. "And you're a lynch mob," Whitfield's voice carried biblical thunder. "I may not approve of their choices, but this is not God's way." Jake risked a look through the shutters. The mob was fragmenting, some men slinking away, others arguing. The fire still crackled behind them, but the immediate shooting had stopped. "Morrison," Thompson called. "You and Miss Brennan come out. You have my protection." "Your protection didn't stop this from happening," Jake called back. "No, it didn't, and I'm sorry for that, but it's stopping it now." Come out, both of you. Let's end this before more blood is spilled." Jake looked at Maggie. Smoke was filling the cabin, flames spreading. They had minutes at most. "Together?" she asked. "Together," he confirmed. They emerged from the burning cabin, Jake's rifle trained on Luther, Maggie's chin high despite the soot and tears from the smoke. The mob, what was left of it, watched sullenly as Thompson's men formed a protective circle. "This ain't over," Luther snarled. "You can't protect them forever. Marshal?" "Maybe not," Thompson agreed. "But I can protect them today, and tomorrow, and every day after until you and yours remember that we have laws in this town. Courts, judges, not mob justice." "What law did they break?" Luther demanded. "None. That's the point." Thompson looked tired, older than his years. "Go home, all of you. Sober up. Remember who you were before you became a mob." The crowd dispersed slowly, muttering threats and prophecies. Jake's cabin continued to burn, taking with it what little he'd accumulated in his attempt at settling down. But he found he didn't care. Possessions were just things. What mattered stood beside him, coughing from the smoke but unbroken. Doc Holcomb approached. "I've got a spare room. You're both welcome until you sort things out." "That's kind, Doc, but," Jake started. "It's not kindness, it's practicality." The doctor interrupted. "This town's tearing itself apart over you two. Maybe if folks see you're just people, not symbols of moral decay, they'll calm down." Reverend Whitfield cleared his throat. I owe you both an apology. My rhetoric from the pulpit helped fuel this. That's not what Christ would have wanted." Maggie laughed, short and bitter. "Easy to apologize after the fire's lit, Reverend." "Yes," he agreed simply. "It is, but I'm apologizing anyway, and offering to help however I can." As they watched Jake's cabin collapse into embers, Marshal Thompson approached. "You could press charges, attempted murder, arson, conspiracy." "Would it stick?" Jake asked. "Probably not, but it might make them think twice next time." "There won't be a next time," Jake said quietly. "One way or another, this ends soon." Thompson studied him. "Don't do anything that'll force me to arrest you. Jake, you're the victim here. Don't become the criminal." "Sometimes," Maggie said. "Those are the only choices we get, victim or criminal. At least criminals have agency." They spent that night in Doc Holcomb's spare room, lying awake, listening to the town settle into uneasy sleep. Jake's hands were burnt from beating at flames, Maggie's hair singed from flying embers. They'd lost everything but each other, and somehow that felt like winning. "They'll come again," Maggie said into the darkness. "I know. We could leave, start fresh somewhere else." "We could," Jake agreed. "But you'd be leaving Thomas, and we'd both be leaving the only truth we've found." "Then we stay and fight." "We stay and live, whatever that brings." Outside, dogs barked at shadows, and the wind carried the smell of ash and possibility. Redemption Creek had shown its ugliest face, but also glimpses of its conscience. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, Jake wondered if it might be winnable. Not redemption that ship had sailed, but maybe something better, the right to be broken in peace, to choose their own damnation, to love without permission from those who'd forgotten what love cost. The morning would bring new challenges, but tonight, scarred and scorched but still breathing, Jake Morrison and Maggie Brennan held each other and refused to be ashamed. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the fire. Doc Holcomb brought it to the small house he'd helped Jake and Maggie rent on the outskirts of town, far enough from the righteous to avoid daily confrontation, close enough to refuse the role of exiles. "It's from Denver," Doc said, handing over the envelope. "Addressed to you, Jake." Jake recognized the handwriting before he opened it. Sarah Bennett's careful script, each letter formed with the same precision she'd once brought to planning their wedding. Maggie, kneading bread at the kitchen table. Noticed his stillness. "What is it?" Jake read aloud. "Mr. Morrison, I write not from anger, but from clarity. The distance has given me perspective on what happened. I need you to know that I understand now. I've met someone here, a banker's son, who sees me as I am, not as a prize or a symbol. We're to be married in the spring. I wanted to thank you. Your cruelty was a kindness I couldn't see. I hope you found whatever peace men like you can find. S. Bennett." Maggie dusted flour from her hands. "How do you feel about that?" "Like a weight's been lifted." Jake admitted, "Like maybe I didn't ruin her life after all." "You gave her the chance to find her own life," Maggie corrected. "There's a difference." Over the past weeks, Redemption Creek had settled into an uneasy truce with its notorious couple. The fire had shocked some citizens into reflection. Others simply grew tired of the energy hatred required. Jake found work breaking horses for the freight company, honest work that used his skills without requiring a gun. Maggie took in sewing, her fingers still clever despite everything. They were surviving, even building something that might be called a life. But Luther Hayes hadn't forgotten or forgiven. He came alone this time. Late on a Thursday evening when the desert was painted purple with dusk. Jake was mending harness on the porch when Luther's horse appeared on the horizon, moving with the deliberate pace of a man who'd made his decision. "Maggie." Jake called quietly. "Company." She joined him on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, such a domestic gesture from a woman the town still called fallen. They watched Luther approach, noting the set of his shoulders, the way his hand rested near his gun. "Hayes," Jake acknowledged when the man reined up. "Morrison." Luther dismounted slowly, keeping his horse between himself and the porch. "I've come to settle this." "Thought we settled it when your mob failed," Jake replied. "That wasn't settling. That was postponement." Luther's face was haggard, aged by weeks of festering anger. "You took everything from me. Morrison, my friend's daughter's honor, my standing in the community. People whisper when I pass now, wondering what else that woman knows about me." "I took nothing," Jake said evenly. "You did that yourself with your choices." "My choices?" Luther laughed bitterly. "What about yours, living openly in sin, flaunting it, making the whole town question everything we've built here?" "Everything you've built on lies," Maggie interjected, "on looking the other way when it's convenient, condemning when it's not." Luther's face twisted. "Shut your mouth, woman. This is between men." "No." Jake stood slowly. "It's between you and your conscience. But you're here to make it about lead and gunpowder because that's easier than looking in a mirror." "Draw your gun. Morrison." "No." The refusal seemed to stun Luther. "What?" "I said no. I'm done killing to solve other people's problems. You want to shoot an unarmed man. That's your choice. But I won't make it easy for you by playing your game." Luther's hand trembled near his gun. "You're a coward." "Maybe." Jake agreed. "Or maybe I'm just tired of adding to the graveyards. You think killing me will restore your honor, make people forget what Maggie said. It won't. It'll just make you a murderer instead of a hypocrite." "Jake," Maggie warned, seeing Luther's face darken. But Jake continued, his voice calm. "Go home, Luther. Go home to your wife who pretends not to know where you spend Tuesday nights. Go home to your children who deserve better than a father consumed by hatred. Go home and figure out how to live with yourself. That's the real challenge." For a long moment, Luther's hand hovered over his gun. The desert held its breath. A hawk circled overhead, patient as death. Then Luther's shoulders sagged. "You've ruined everything," he said, but the fire had gone out of his voice. "No," Maggie said gently. "We've just stopped pretending. The ruins were always there." Luther mounted his horse without another word, rode away slower than he'd come. They watched until he was a speck against the darkening sky. "He might come back," Maggie observed. "He might," Jake agreed. "But I don't think so. He looked too tired." "We're all tired," Maggie said, leaning against him. "Tired of fighting, tired of justifying, tired of being symbols instead of people." As if in response to her words, another rider appeared, Marshal Thompson. Moving fast, he reined up hard, dust swirling. "Thought I might find Luther here," he said, noting the fresh hoof prints leading away. "Everything all right?" "Fine," Jake said. "He came to talk. He talked. He left." Thompson studied them both, then nodded. "Good. I'm tired of violence in my town." He paused. "There's news from the town council. They've voted. You're both free to stay in Redemption Creek as long as you obey the laws." It wasn't unanimous, but it was enough. Maggie laughed. "Surprised? We won." "You survived," Thompson corrected. "Sometimes that's the same thing. Folk are starting to realize the energy spent hating you two could be better used elsewhere. Plus, you pay your rent, work honest jobs, and haven't actually broken any laws. Hard to exile people for that, even if their choices offend." After Thompson left, Jake and Maggie sat on their porch watching the stars emerge. The desert night brought its usual symphony: coyotes, wind, the distant sound of life going on. "What now?" Maggie asked. "Now we live," Jake said simply, "day by day, choice by choice, together. No grand redemption, no dramatic transformation. No, just this, just us, just truth." Maggie smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face. "That's enough." Inside the house, Sarah's letter sat on the table next to Maggie's sewing and Jake's gun belt. 3 lives that had intersected in pain but found different kinds of peace. Sarah in Denver with her appropriate husband, building a life on safer ground. Jake and Maggie in Redemption Creek, building something harder but more honest. The town would never fully accept them. Some wounds scarred rather than healed. But acceptance and peace weren't the same thing. They'd found their peace in each other, in the choice to stop running from what they were, in the fierce freedom of having nothing left to prove. Jake took Maggie's hand, work-roughened fingers intertwining. "No regrets?" "None that matter," she replied. "You?" "I regret the pain caused getting here, but not here itself." They went inside, closing the door on Redemption Creek's judgment. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, whispers, cold shoulders, the constant weight of being outsiders. But tonight they had warmth, shelter, and each other. In the morning, Jake would break horses and Maggie would sew curtains for the banker's wife. They'd walk through town with heads high, neither flaunting nor hiding. They'd visit Thomas's grave on Sunday while others attended church. They'd build a life on the margins, but it would be their life, chosen with eyes open. The candle flickered on the table, casting dancing shadows. Outside, the desert wind sang its ancient song of endurance and adaptation. And in a small house on the edge of a town that couldn't quite forgive them, Jake Morrison and Maggie Brennan proved that sometimes the greatest act of rebellion was simply refusing to be ashamed of who you'd become. Some stories end with transformation, others with triumph. But the truest stories, like theirs, end with acceptance of themselves, of each other, of the price required to live authentically in a world that preferred comfortable lies. They'd chosen each other over everything else, and in the unforgiving landscape of Redemption Creek, that choice stood like a monument to the possibility that even broken people could build something whole. Even fallen souls could rise not to grace, but to truth. The candle burned low, and they held each other in the darkness. 2 people who'd found home not in a place, but in the honest recognition of another's scars. And that, perhaps, was the only redemption worth having. Thank you for listening to this Wild West love story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale. Are you listening during your commute, relaxing at home, or perhaps somewhere unexpected? Please subscribe to our channel From Wild West and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and perspectives make our community richer, just like Jake and Maggie's truth enriched Redemption Creek.